Panic disorder and panic attacks can be so debilitating. It can be so overwhelming, and over time, really impact your life so significantly. Now, I want to give you the good news right up front, which is that it is possible to fully recover from panic disorder. I'm going to talk you through some of it, give you a framework for thinking about it, and it is possible to get over having panic attacks for the long term. The symptoms of panic attacks, the sweating, the palpitations, the heart racing, the fear that you might be dying, or the fear you're going crazy. Sometimes people have a feeling that they can't swallow or breathe, their stomach can be upset. Some people get dizzy, lightheaded. I mean, panic attacks are just horrible. And what happens when you have your first one, maybe, is it's so horrible you never want to have that again, which is perfectly understandable. But the problem is that what happens is that then that fear of having another panic attack gets greater and greater. You might avoid more and more things to avoid having one in the future, but that anticipation of having one is actually what leads panic attacks into panic disorder. So, fully knowing the symptoms of panic attacks can sometimes be helpful because a lot of people have these. So, instead of feeling like something is bizarrely wrong, you can be like, okay, no, these are panic attack symptoms. I know sometimes when I read a list of symptoms, people feel like, oh, this is making me more anxious. But I just want you to know that, yes, those are the symptoms. Some others could be chills, hot flashes, derealization, which is a feeling that things aren't real, or depersonalization, which feels like you're being detached from yourself. All of those are symptoms of panic disorder. And you don't have to have all those symptoms. In fact, to be diagnosed with a panic attack, it's really only four of those symptoms. But it is an intense burst of fear and anxiety. It usually peaks within 10 minutes and then resolves afterwards. Not always, but usually it's a very quick onset, very intense peak, and then resolves within not too long a time, although you might have all sorts of symptoms sort of on a carryover, leftover basis. And of course, each time you have one, the fear of having another one gets worse. So I also just recorded a video that can help you like in the midst of a panic attack. And it also can help you if you are anticipating having one, but it's really in the moment techniques that can help you calm your physiological response. So I am going to have that linked right around here, but hopefully for watching this, you're not in the middle of a panic attack. You just want to learn, how do you get rid of this problem? How do you overcome this for the long term? Now, cognitive behavioral therapy has been very well proven to be very effective with panic attacks, really like cure them. And the techniques I'm going to talk you through today will be CBT based techniques, because it has also been shown that people can help themselves with these issues quite a bit through self help, but it also might be that you do need a trained specialist to help you even further. If you're new here, my name is Barbara Heffernan. I was a psychotherapist for over 20 years, and I had a private practice specializing in anxiety and trauma. And I know firsthand that people can recover from panic disorder through talk therapy. But let's start at the beginning with understanding the cycle of what happens with a panic disorder. So, in general, cognitive behavioral therapy really focuses on how our cognitions, our thoughts, interact with our feelings, both physical feelings and emotional feelings, and then those interact with our behaviors. And all three interact with each other, influence the other. It doesn't start in one place. You will hear people say everything starts with a thought. Sometimes, but sometimes people with panic disorder, it starts physically. Doesn't There was no thought there. So it doesn't matter where it starts. All three things interact. So I'm going to run through this with an example for somebody where it does begin with a thought, and then I'm going to run through it with an example of for somebody who it just begins with those physical symptoms, okay? I think you'll be able to relate to both. And let me know in the comments because I always do want to hear from you about whether the material is making sense and whether it's helpful. Okay, so let's take Robert, who had a horrible experience playing basketball when he was in like ninth grade. He was reasonably tall, he was pretty athletic, he loved to play basketball, but during his very first game in front of an audience, he ran to the wrong basket and made a basket, but he felt humiliated in front of the crowd. Obviously, people were shocked and gasping and making noises. And then his teammates were very upset, and he felt totally humiliated. He also had skin that showed blushing, and therefore he felt like everybody could know how humiliated he was. He couldn't even stand going to school the next few days. So, this was a pretty traumatic event for him, understandably. And it really got lodged in his emotional brain. And then, pretty much anytime he was sort of on display or being watched by a crowd, he began to panic. So, normal reaction, avoid it whenever you can, avoid it. And then, when you can't avoid it, like you have to give a presentation at school or you have to go in front of a crowd and do something, he would anticipate blushing, doing something terribly wrong, panicking, and he developed over time a panic disorder. So, for him, how this cycle worked would be that some kind of external event was coming up, something where he would be in front of other people. His panic would start with the cognitions. I'm going to be humiliated. I'm going to blush. Everybody will know that I am embarrassed. I'm going to do something wrong. All of these anticipatory anxiety thoughts long before the event are escalating his anxiety. And then those thoughts, as I said, connect to the behaviors, which is to avoid whenever you can. But then when you can't, it's even worse because you have not been giving your old brain what we would call restorative experiences. But because that old brain doesn't have other experiences where it can be like, okay, well, I got embarrassed that one time, but I did great this time because you've been avoiding, then those big events just get more and more anxiety provoking. So the avoiding and the cognitions are leading to anxiety in the moment, both the emotional feeling of it and the physical escalation. And then for Robert, as it would get closer and closer to the date of some kind of presentation he needed to make at work or a social event where he was called on to give a talk or something, his anxiety would keep going up to the point that he began to have full-blown panic attacks before the event and therefore couldn't do them. So, this I think gives you an idea of an example of where the panic disorder cycle is triggered by thoughts. Now, those thoughts are connected to an earlier event, and we will be talking a little bit about triggers. And I think I'm going to be recording a whole video on triggers for panic attacks. So, let's take somebody totally different who has their first panic attack completely out of the blue as a young adult. So, in this case, I'm going to talk about Susie, who was hit with a panic attack in the middle of a grocery store. All of a sudden, she felt like she was having a heart attack. Her heart rate was sky high. She wasn't having any real thoughts of not wanting to do something or anything. She was definitely feeling somewhat rushed at that moment. And there were a few other things bothering her, but totally unrelated to the panic attack. And it just hit out of the blue. She really did think she was having some kind of stroke or heart attack, even though she was only in her mid 20s. Other people noticed that she was very distressed and she leaned down and then eventually sat down on the floor, and people came over and 911 was called and she was taken to the hospital and they put her through a whole lot of tests. And at the end of all of it, the doctor said, nope, you're having a panic attack, nothing physical. Now, that doctor was not quite right because panic attacks are physical. It's just that the cause is not a quote unquote medical problem. It's anxiety or something else happening in the brain. Now, I think we are all integrated, right? So this separation isn't always that helpful, but many people with panic attacks will be told it's in your head. But in our heads, the second we think something anxious, we produce adrenaline, which is chemical in our body. Anyway, back to Susie. So she goes home. She's embarrassed that she used 911, all the time she spent in the emergency room. She feels like there's nothing wrong with me and she feels terrible about it. But the first thing that she's really thinking about is, I don't ever want that to happen again. Is it going to happen again? Now, in this situation, this hit her out of the blue. It started physically. Why? That question actually leads to something I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video today about going deeper on our triggers. Because with everybody I ever worked with, for those people where the panic attacks really hit physically and out of the blue, there almost always was some type of experience or early childhood event that was fairly traumatic or highly upsetting, let's just say, that kind of got lodged in that old brain. And so on a subconscious level was triggered by something. So usually you can, over time, do some kind of investigation to figure out where did that come from. But in the moment, it feels like it is just boom, physical. So how does the cycle work in that case? Well, with Susie, she had all these physical symptoms. What was her interpretation of them? Her interpretation was, something's wrong with me. I'm in physical danger. I might be dying. I might be having a heart attack. So her interpretation of those symptoms was that there was a major problem. And the behavior, she was able to make the phone call, go to the emergency room, get checked out, and then told, nope, no problem here. But that didn't actually make her feel better, right? And then the problem with a panic attack is that then the next time it happens, people don't say, oh, well, I know there's nothing physically wrong with me, so something weird must have triggered my physiological anxiety response, and I don't really have to worry about it because there's no danger here. People don't do that. They go into the same loop of thoughts. Well, maybe now I'm really having the heart attack. Maybe there really is something wrong with me and the doctors didn't find it. So again, the thoughts that interpret the physical anxiety symptoms are going to contribute to the anxiety. And then the behaviors are going to end up being either avoidant or compulsive. So avoidant behavior would be to avoid going to that grocery store ever again. Maybe begin to avoid going any place where there's other crowds of people. Maybe avoid going outside on a Tuesday if it happened on a Tuesday. Eventually you might avoid going outside altogether. So that behavior contributes to the anxiety. And I do have a video on the avoidance anxiety cycle that's worth watching if you tend to avoid, because that avoidance truly does increase your anxiety. And then the other behavior that I've seen very commonly in these situations is somebody begins to compulsively research health issues, on and on and on and on. And that compulsive behavior of constantly researching might give you a temporary relief in the anxiety, but long term increases it. So that's also in that avoidance anxiety cycle video, a little bit more on how that all works. But hopefully you're getting a sense of how our thoughts, physical body sensations, emotional feelings, and behaviors spiral out of control. So the cure is to figure out, where can I intervene? And you will see a lot on the internet. Intervene with your thoughts, change how you think, change how you think. And yeah, I think changing how you think is helpful. But for a lot of people, that's not the easiest place to start or the best place to start. So cognitive behavioral therapy for panic attacks will help you outline a plan of where you can intervene. And the other piece I would like to communicate about this CBT cycle is that people primarily want to change how they feel, right? You don't want to feel these panic attacks anymore, and I understand. But you can't directly target your feelings. Now, there are some techniques that help those feelings for sure, but to change how you feel, it almost always requires that you change how you behave or how you think. So the interventions are going to be in the behavioral realm and the cognitive realm. And on the internet, you'll see everybody focus on cognitive, change how you think, change how you think, your whole life changes. Well, you can't always do that. I know that. So, changing certain behaviors. Now, I'm going to focus on the behaviors that help you physiologically relax. That would be one of the first points of intervention for almost everybody who suffers with panic disorder. And if you hate breathing exercises, I know they sometimes can make people anxious. So, that video that I just recorded went through some grounding techniques, and I have another video on grounding techniques. I won't be able to link them all right here, but look for something called grounding techniques if you hate the breathing. And then over time, developing the capacity to do some of those breathing techniques, because that is really the way to communicate to that old brain that you are safe. And that's what we want to do. We want to really communicate to the old part of the brain, which is what's driving the panic. And that part of the brain doesn't have language centers. So it's almost like if you were to calm a puppy, how would you calm the puppy? You wouldn't calm the puppy by saying, "You have nothing to be anxious about. Why are you panicking?" You would get down on the floor, you'd pick up the puppy, you'd hug him, right? You would physically help the puppy relax physiologically. So, those are the first tools to add to your arsenal, right? And don't try to use those when you're in the middle of a panic attack if you have not been practicing them. Those tools need to be practiced really on a daily basis. I did put together a 3-week program, and it's free and on YouTube, the mini series, and that one I will definitely link here for you. But it's a 3-week series of guiding you through daily practices of safe place exercise, diaphragmatic breathing, and grounding exercises. Because when you practice these things on a daily basis, you are not only keeping yourself less anxious, but you're also increasing your capacity to access these tools when you do begin to get super anxious. So when people say these things don't work, it's because they forget about them until they're in the middle of a panic, and then, yeah, they may not work so well right then. Okay? So that's the first area, to put together a series of tools that help you relax physically. Another really important thing to think about as you think through the behavioral interventions that are going to help are the behaviors that are avoidant or the behaviors that are compulsively focused on the anxiety. So, identifying those behaviors and then not avoiding or not engaging in the compulsive behavior, that gets a little more complicated. I do talk about this in some of my other videos, and let me know in the comments if you want me to speak more on that. But identifying those behaviors you do that actually contribute to your cycle, and then how do you intervene so you're not engaging in those. But a category that is a little more clear cut, what you're consuming. So, right now, I'm just going to talk about caffeine, alcohol, tobacco. Caffeine is a stimulant. Caffeine, for pretty much everybody, increases your heart rate. It can feel like it's giving you energy, but it often is an anxious type of energy. And caffeine can increase anxiety in people who have anxiety, and it can actually cause panic attacks if consumed in large enough amounts. A friend of mine is actually an emergency room doctor, and he has talked to me about how often people will show up in the emergency room thinking they're having a panic attack. And then when he talks through with them what they consumed during the day, like one person had just had 8 cans of Red Bull. The amount of caffeine was unbelievable, and you can have a caffeine overdose. So, caffeine can directly contribute to panic attacks. I know it's a hard habit to stop, but when you think about how painful panic disorder is, how much it's impacting your life, maybe it's worth it. Now, on the other side, alcohol and tobacco, and then there's other drugs that could fall into this category, but they're biphasic. It means they have 2 phases. So, alcohol, first phase, it makes you feel more relaxed. So unfortunately, people with anxiety will sometimes feel like, well, the alcohol relaxes me, but that's its initial impact on you. Once the half life is reached of the alcohol, you are actually left with fewer internal relaxation chemicals because the alcohol kind of makes them all rush in at once. And then you're left with less. So when you wake up in the morning, if you've had a drink or two the night before, you are likely to be more anxious in the morning than you would have been without the alcohol. And tobacco, very often people will feel, well, tobacco relaxes me when I inhale it, which could be connected to how good inhalation can be for anxiety. But the chemical of tobacco also can make people feel both relaxed and alert, but then it's biphasic. When that is out of your system, you are more anxious than you would have been otherwise. So, those are three of, and there's obviously others, but those are three things to avoid if you get panic attacks. Okay, the cognitive interventions. So, the cognitive part of the panic disorder cycle is largely about how you are interpreting the panic symptoms. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is the anticipation of having the panic attack. So let's start with the interpretation of the panic symptoms. So, the interpretation in one of the cases I talked about today was really a lot focused on sort of social anxiety, on being embarrassed, on being publicly humiliated, on what was going to happen. And therefore, once those panic feelings began, the fear, I'll blush, other people will notice, I won't be able to continue. In the other situation, the interpretation of those panic symptoms was that it was something physically extremely dangerous. I'm going to die. Other common cognitions that go with panic disorder are, I'm going crazy, I'm going to go crazy, this will never end, I won't ever be able to function, right? The thoughts go on and they can really catastrophize. And I know those thoughts feel very, very true. I know it. I know how true they feel, but they're not true. Now, with the medical thoughts, by all means, people should have a thorough workup with a doctor if they think there's something wrong with them. I am not a medical doctor, right? I'm licensed as a therapist, and I would never want to tell somebody not to go to a doctor. However, if you've already had the doctor review everything, you've already really confirmed that you have the symptoms of panic disorder, then it would be really, really helpful to begin to create distance from your thoughts. We don't have to believe all of our thoughts. A lot of my anxiety videos can be helpful on this, so I can't cover it all in this one, but meditation, mindfulness, therapy, really thinking thoughts about your thoughts. That's called metacognition, right? What we think about what we think. But beginning to realize not all our thoughts are true, that just because we feel a thought is true does not mean it's true. And creating more of an observer mind, more of a curiosity mind that can look at the thoughts like, oh yeah, okay, well, there I am again. That's a common theme. Why do I have that theme? Is that theme helping me? So, really being able to distance from the thoughts, question them, and then reframing them. And I know this is way easier said than done. Totally get that. And it takes a lot of work, right? So it takes a real effort, sometimes guidance, but I really want you to know that you can do this, right? I do have a free webinar on rewiring your brain for joy and confidence, and part of it really talks about how to get the brain to focus on the joyful things so that you can live a happier life. But it's also about rewiring these patterns that we set up because this whole panic disorder video that I've given here so far is really a description of how we create certain pathways in our brain. And they often are created by original traumatic, big T, little t traumas, very upsetting events. And then a whole story develops, and then a whole superhighway in the brain. But the brain can be changed. Neuroplasticity. Even when you're older, your brain can change and improve, and you can begin to rewire it by a combination of thoughts and behaviors and connecting different things together. So it is not all about changing the thoughts. Okay, so I talked a bit about the thoughts in terms of how they interpret the panic symptoms. I also want to talk about the thoughts in terms of the anticipation, which is actually one of the real things that drives panic disorder. Is, as I mentioned earlier, after you have your first panic attack, or maybe your second, then you begin this anticipation cycle. And I do have a video on anticipatory anxiety, and almost all anxiety is anticipatory. But that anticipation of expecting one, fearing one, trying to avoid one, trying to manage one, all of that energy is contributing to your anxiety and contributing to the panic disorder. So, a real key here is to stop fearing the fear, right? Because so much energy is going into fearing that panic attack. And I know it's horrible, it's something you never want to experience again. But there's a whole technique, and you can find a number of videos on this called Ride the Wave, like just beginning to be like, okay, some waves can be scary if I'm surfing. I don't surf, but I can only imagine. But I'm just going to ride it. So I can get through this next panic attack. I've already gotten through 5, right? Maybe if you've had 5 panic attacks already, you can be like, okay, yep, I did end up okay after that was over. It was horrible. I don't want it again. But you know what? I know it's not going to kill me. I know I can get through it. So it's kind of like relaxing with the thought that, yep, okay, maybe I'll have a panic attack is going to help you not have a panic attack, because you'll be letting go of all that anticipation, which is pretty much guaranteeing the panic attack. So, riding the wave, stop being so afraid of them. Again, I know easier said than done, but trying to give you thoughts that you can then work with, because it'd be hard to cure this with a 20-minute video. But these are things you can begin to work with, integrate, explore more information on. If you have a therapist, talk about it with them, do some journaling, really think it through, but riding that wave. And the last thing I want to mention is really, once you have learned these physiologically calming tools and you're practicing them daily or very regularly, right? And then you begin to work with your thoughts, question them, have a little distance from them. Then it'll be time to really work through the triggers for your panic. So you can think about the triggers both as being sort of like the in the moment triggers, the things you avoid, the things you're afraid of, the situations you don't want to get into. So you could see those as triggers. For people where the panic hits out of the blue and there's no preconceived thought, it could be a trigger of smell, sight, sound. But then eventually, to do the deeper work on these triggers, where did they really come from and how do you heal them? Now, EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, very effective therapy technique. I found it super helpful for helping people recover from panic disorder. And I will do a video on EMDR for panic disorder, but I'm also about to record a video on triggers for panic. And so subscribe to my channel if you haven't. If you liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up, because it's very helpful and motivating for me. And leave me comments. Let me know, what questions do you have? What do you think? What sounded helpful? And if you have ideas about something else that helps you, put it in the comments. It could help somebody else. Thank you. I so appreciate you being part of this community. If you think somebody else could benefit from this video, please share it with them. And I am here to try to spread information and help people live joyfully around the world. All right, thanks. See you next week.